friends. We continue our discussion about Joshua, this great man of God, a hero like all these other great characters in the Old Testament, but a man who, whether he has feet of clay, he certainly serves a people with feet of clay. And I hope you might go back, if you remember, if not, go back and look at the episode right before this. We talked about Joshua as the man of peace, the man of God, the spiritual leader for the people of Israel, the one who, as an administrator, helped distribute the inheritance so that people could figure out what part of this promised land they would enjoy in terms of their tribe. So he's not just a warrior. He's not just a general. He certainly was a man who was the one who put that nation together, this long-standing promise now that the promised land had come into reality. But what I want to talk about now is about the part about Joshua that we do often think about. Joshua the warrior, Joshua the general, Joshua the fighter, because certainly he was a man who led the people of Israel through some dramatic, climactic battles as they came into that promised land. It was indeed a promised land, but the people of Israel weren't the first ones to hear the promise. Long centuries before, God had said to Abram and to Sarah and to Isaac and to Jacob, those original patriarchs, this land, as far as you can see, will one day be yours. All the inheritance, children like stars of the sky and sands of the sea, this land will be yours, but it would be centuries before it would happen. The people of Israel would go down for 450 years in Egypt, and then through Moses led back from Egypt. Now, half a millennium later, they're finally back at the land, but in the meantime, there are a lot of Canaanites and Jebusites and Hittites and Amorites. All these other people have discovered this is a nice place to be. And so they weren't about to give that land up. There wasn't any promise that they had overheard. So the children of Israel finally get there, but the land has to be taken. And the people who've lived there now for centuries are not one bit about to give it up easily. So it would be a difficult, in fact, a bloody path to try to reclaim this promise that was as old as the patriarchs. And so the man for the season was a man named Joshua. Joshua, whose name Heshua or Hosea or even the name Jesus all come from the same Hebrew word. It means that God saves. And people who take up arms, people who are good with swords, or for that matter, tanks, need to always remember that in fact it's God who does the victory. God has the power. I don't think Joshua ever forgot that it wasn't his sword, it was the sword of God. It was God's fighting of the army and with the army that made all of the difference. So that's what it was with Joshua. This man of war was always a man of faith. And in that way, he certainly did follow Moses, who himself also led the people of Israel through the defeating of some of their enemies even before they got to the promised land. So we think about Joshua the warrior, and one of the first ones that comes to our mind always is the battle for Jericho. You remember that he leads them across with the priest, with the Ark of the Covenant, and the Jordon River at flood stage stops and backs up just like the Red Sea did under Moses. They come all the way across, 40,000 fighting men, and then the Ark of God comes out and they have a covenant renewal right there for the first time, their first beachhead in the Promised Land as they've crossed the Jordan River. And now the first city, the first fortified, and it's a big fortified city, is the city of Jericho. Now, truthfully, at this time it was probably only about 8 or 9 acres within the fortified heavy city walls of Jericho. So I don't mean it's a sprawling metroplex, but it was a heavily fortified and a very important city because it's right there along that Jordan River through that lush Jordan Valley and had a rich trading position because of that. But Jericho was a Canaanite city that was not going to fall easily, but it was the very first conquest to be made. If they're going to really establish their beachhead on this new land, it would take Jericho. So there was a very specific way that God instructed Joshua not to depend on their normal West Point kind of Naval Academy ways of taking a city. He gave them a whole brand new way of faith to consider taking the city, which was in fact, it was a test of faith, not only for Joshua, but whether the people would trust Joshua as he related to them God's way of taking a city. You remember how the story goes? Here's what God said to Joshua. Okay, we're going to take Jericho, mighty walled city, archers at the top of all those walls. We're not going to do it with siege works and all those things that you normally do. We're not going to try to starve them out for 2 years. No, the way we're going to take this city, God says, is this. Those same priests who took the ark, well, you had to be made of pretty fortified stuff to serve in the choir in this day because the priests are going first, once again. And it says, the priests take the ark of God because the ark of God leads you. And then you follow, not too close, stay about 1,000 yards back because God is so holy. Even though it's your God, he's not just your pal, he's holy. And so you follow the ark, as the presence of God leads you into battle. He says, take that ark, follow the ark around, and then when you got to the city, put some soldiers on all sides of that ark and began to march around the city. Now, it was probably more than just the 8 or 9 acres, because you had to stay out of the way of the archers. So it might have taken a little bit longer circle because of that. And here was their instructions. March around in total silence. 1 lap around the city. So the entire city, the entire set of archers see you with all the wonderment about what's about to go on. You've already watched them cross the Jordon River. What's going on here? You march around in total silence. And then there's one blaring of the ram's horn, the shofar horn, which is a weird sound anyway. And then they went back to the camp. The next day, they would do the very same thing. 1 silent lap around. 3rd day, 4th, 5th, 6th day. 6 days in a row do that. It looked like a totally bogus scheme. And probably after 6 days, the people in Jericho were thinking, these people are running around in circles, so they hadn't got a chance against us. They hadn't even fired a shot. But God said to them on the 7th day, when you march around the city, march around 7 times. And then when you get to the end of the 7th time, let all the horns go off at the same time and let the people cry out with a great shout. And that's what they did. But this time, on the 7th day, at the 7th lap, with all the ram's horns blaring, when the people shouted, the walls fell flat. Imagine what it's like trusting in your walls if you live in Jericho. And you think the walls are your protection, and then suddenly the walls are gone. Well, that's the way it was, and of course then the city was easy to take. I wonder, we usually identify ourselves being with Joshua and with the people of God when we read this story, but I wonder what it was like to be in Jericho on that day. It makes me wonder when I think about that, I wonder what walls that I have built and fortified that I put all my trust in. There have been some of us who found out that the walls of our health, strength, the walls of our finances, the walls of our reputation, of our friendships, our connections. Many times we find out that those walls can fall flat and maybe in an instant. This is a very earthquake-prone region. Was it an earthquake? It doesn't even matter. However God did it is how God did it. But the fact is the walls fell flat. And now all of a sudden they're vulnerable, and God takes the city of Jericho now because of it very easily. Now here was the deal. God told the Israelites, in addition to trusting me about how I'm going to do it, here's the other thing. God says the entire city is called Haram, or this is a holy war, so you don't take spoils for yourself. Everything has to be destroyed. It's this holy war mentality. The theology of this was God is fighting the battle, and everything in effect is sent up as a burnt offering to God. The city is burnt. Every single person is killed. Soldiers, yes. Women and children, yes. Animals, yes. And God said to the people through Joshua, don't take any spoils. Normally in those days, you grab whatever you could if you were on the winning side. Don't take any spoils. Everything belongs to God. It doesn't belong to you because God got the victory, not you. That was the price of obedience. Well, it was a great victory. Everybody's celebrating, but here's the story. One guy just couldn't resist some gold and silver that he found as he was helping defeat Jericho, and he just hid some of it in the corner of his tent. It didn't seem like a big thing. I mean, my goodness. It was in the corner of his tent. Who would know? He's like so many of us, this guy Achan, he's such a fool. He's like so many of us. We think that the little thing we do in the corner of our tent, nobody's going to see that. What difference would it make? What difference does it make? I mean, it's just something sparkly that I want. I'm hidden for a time later. But here's what happened. They went out the next day to take the next city, another town called Ai, just a few miles down the road. And this time, once again, the people went up against actually a smaller, less significant city than Jericho, full of the victory of Jericho right behind them. They went out against this city, but here's what happened. When they attacked that city, the kings of Ai descended on them and slaughtered them, and it was Israel's first defeat in the Promised Land. It was all of a sudden they're wondering, has God abandoned us? I thought God brought it. It was a crisis of faith as well as a military disaster. And people are now wondering, okay, Joshua, you got us one battle, but now you're 1-1. This is a 50-50 season going here. It was a crisis in so many ways. And God said to Joshua, here's why you lost that battle. Here's why you lost. The promise you were supposed to make to me was that everything that belonged to me from Jericho, this holy war, somebody cheated on this and said, Joshua, find out who it was, and here's how you find out. Have each of the tribes come forward, the 12 tribes. I'll pick out which one of the tribes. Within the tribes, have the large families identified by clans. I'll tell you which clan. Within the clans, I'll tell you which individual family. Within the families, I'll tell you which household. And that's exactly what happened. He had them appear before him one after another, until finally, as God's Spirit directed Joshua, it came down to this one guy. And Joshua said, okay, what'd you do? What'd you do? And he confessed, and he paid a severe price for that disobedience. And he and his household destroyed because of their disobedience. But what that taught for the children of Israel was, this is a corporate thing. We're not just individuals, we're the people of God. And it requires obedience from all of us. And God means it when God says obey. So with that having been cleansed, then they go about trying to set, now Joshua setting another battle to take Ai, this city. And it was actually some intriguing warfare strategy. He said, here's what we're going to do. He said he took his 40,000 troops, he took about 3,000 of them and put them in front of the city again. And then he put a whole phalanx on either side in ambush out of sight where the king wouldn't be able to see them. And so the small band came up to the city, and when the city started throwing spears and things at them, they started to run like they had done the day before when they were defeated. And it was a ruse, it was an ambush, and it was designed to draw the people, the warriors, out of the walled city of Ai, because they thought, hey, here they go again, let's rout them again. And so Joshua was actually with that group, and so they withdraw, fleeing back down to the Jordan Valley. Then meanwhile, once they're out of the city, then all the other armies that were perched around, hidden behind the hillside, came in, destroyed the city, set it on fire. Now the armies that were here thinking they were chasing this little bunch turned around and saw their city back home on fire. And that was a signal also for this bunch to turn on them, and now they're caught in a crossfire between these two bands of Israel's armies, and all the people of Ai are totally eliminated. It actually, we have to give this for Joshua. He was indeed God's warrior, but he was actually a pretty smart general too. And there are those today who actually study Joshua's battle plans even for today. Well, this was the beginning of then an unbroken string of military victories. There would not be another military defeat under Joshua for the rest of his entire leadership. And they didn't take the entire land of Israel. Even by the time he died at 110 years old, there were still pretty major portions of the ultimate promised land that had not been taken. Once again, something really worth doing probably can't be done in a single lifetime. And so the baton would be passed to people who would follow him. Actually, under King David, centuries later yet again, would the kingdom finally get to the imagined distance it was supposed to. This is 1300 BC. It'd be 300 years later before David would come. But under Joshua, in his years, they made enormous strides. So there were these battles in the southern parts of what is now Israel, and then he even made some forays into the northern parts of Israel and began to conquer there. Conquered ultimately 32 kings. Now, truthfully, in this day, each city had its own king. These were not individual kingdoms so much, but they were 32 fortified cities, and one after another, they fell like dominoes before Joshua and his mighty men of valor. And it says, in a beautiful way, it says, and after all those years of fighting, finally it says the people came to rest, and the battles were done. Some of the cities just said, hey, we'll make a treaty with you. We give up before you even sack us. We'll live in peace with you. And most of them just fell. It was bloody. It was gruesome. And we can look at it from the side of the people of faith and the people of God, knowing this was God's people and God's promise to Abraham and those who would follow. This was the people in the land of God God wanted to carve out for them. But we're also aware that the people who died miserably and horribly. War is, no matter how you read it, no matter which side of it you're on, war is dreadful. And when you read the stories in Joshua, they're not for the faint of heart, because they believed that what God was calling them to do was not only defeat the armies who opposed them, but then when you defeated the army, to ransack the city, totally destroy it, kill every single human being. Let no life be left. Every woman, every child. Non-combatants killed just as much as military. What do we do with that? As I tape this episode, in this very set of weeks, The country of Russia is invading the country of Ukraine. And it is on all of our hearts, on all of our headlines, heavy on our hearts. Because once again, not only are combatants being killed, but non-combatants as well. And it is a dreadful thing that tears our hearts out to watch it. It is atrocity, perhaps even genocide. But when you read Joshua, it almost reads similarly. What do we do with this? Joshua believed. The story is told as this was the gruesome and difficult way for God to do what God was doing, to carve out this place for God's people. And there's no question that people were the people that not only God would bless, but through whom God would bless the entire world. It's true, it was a place for them. But I think it has to be said, too, that one day, 13 centuries later, another man would come to this same land of promise in Israel, bearing the same Hebrew name as the warrior Joshua. And his name would be Jesus. His name would also mean the Lord saves. And this one would come to bring us a kingdom that wasn't secured by swords. This one came to talk about even loving your enemies and forgiving those even who put you to death. And in him is actually the only real peace. You don't ultimately establish peace by just having better arms and more of army than your neighbor. Ultimately, peace has to be secured at a deeper level. We're grateful to God for the great warrior as well as the great administrator Joshua. In his day, he was one of the ones for whom the Lord saved. But as Christians, we're even more grateful that the story didn't end there and that his way down the line successor, Yeshua, Jesus, taught us an even better way. May we be women and men of peace in what is still a warring and troubled world. And thanks be to God that we can lift our eyes and even seeing a clearer picture of God's heart and design in the person of Jesus Christ, who, oddly enough, bore the same name as Joshua.
Images for Heroes with Feet of Clay are provided by Kingstone Comics.
The best-selling book of all time. Now, the most complete graphic adaptation of all time. Action, adventure, romance, doctrine, history, the future. The Kingstone Bible. Own it today.
The Kingstone Bible and Kingstone Comics, available at the First Church Book Center or online at kingstone.co.